Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Concurrent Paper Session 2. We are grateful to our three presenters today, as well as to our featured respondent, Father Mark Massa. By way of introduction, Mark Massa is the director of the Boisi Center for Religion and American Public Life here at Boston College and the host of this conference, where he's also a professor of theology. He's a Catholic priest, a member of the Society of Jesus, and the author of 7 books, his most recent being The Structure of Theological Revolutions, Catholic Debates About Natural Law. His monograph, published in 1999, Catholics in American Culture, Fulton Sheen, Dorothy Day, and the Notre Dame Football Team, received the Alpha Sigma Nu Award for Best Work in Theology for 1999 to 2000. His ongoing area of research is American Catholic Faith and Culture of the Past Century. As the first holder of the Karl Rahner Chair in Theology at Fordham, Father Massa also directed the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies. From 2010 to 2016, he served as Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry here at Boston College. So welcome, Father Massa, and thank you for your time today.
Oh, sounds more important than it is. Why don't we, I suggest that we do this in alphabetical order. So Liam, do you want to start off? And we have each panelist has how many minutes, Zach?
No more than 20 minutes apiece.
Okay.
15 to 20 minutes.
Liam, the show is yours.
Thank you to Zach, and thank you, Father Massa. And I'll be keeping time on my end to make sure that we stick to that. So thank you for reminding me. So my topic today goes about as far back as possible in American history and American life in studying the intersection between religious life and political life. My discussion will be centering on the relationship between biblical law and political and legal structures in 17th century Plymouth colony, as told through the story of a single court case. Before I begin, I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor David Sipe at Boston University for his insightful comments on my research. Secondly, I do wish to provide a brief content warning. Please note that this paper does discuss issues of criminal law that relate to sexual misconduct, animal abuse, and end in capital punishment, though these are told solely in a legal and historical sense. Finally, and very briefly, my apologies to any BC students and faculty present that you have to be subjected to a paper from a BU student. And with that, I can begin. Thomas Granger was approximately 15 when he was executed in the fall of 1642. Who was Thomas Granger? Why was he executed so young? And what can his short life elucidate about the relationship between society, politics, and biblical law in one of America's oldest settlements? As Plymouth Colony's governor, William Bradford, noted, horrible as it is to mention Granger's story, the truth of the history requires it. Thomas Granger was a young servant to Love Brewster, the son of Plymouth's highest religious leader, and was accused, convicted, and executed for the crime of buggery with animals. Granger confessed and was sentenced to die, the only instance of such punishment used in Plymouth for a crime other than murder. Before his execution, each animal with which he had acted was killed and buried in turn. No part of any such animal used for human consumption. In deciding on this harsh and violent punishment, Plymouth's leadership looked to the Bible and the book of Leviticus's prohibition on, quote, lying with beasts. Among the earliest records of the colony's earliest crimes, Thomas Granger's crime exemplified the use of biblical law to justify a sentence and execution. But Granger's case is an exception and not the rule to the contention that religion was dominant in Plymouth colony's legal and political systems. To question longstanding historiographic classifications, this presentation will first conduct a microhistorical reading of Granger's case. It will then connect Granger's case to the broader context of early American legal system to reveal that the supposed biblicism in Plymouth colony was a misbelief of later historians' creation in studying their political system. Lastly, it will offer comparisons to the use of biblical sources in contemporaneous English cases. In so doing, it will subvert the assumption that many legal historians have held that Plymouth's colony was uniquely steeped in biblical law. Plymouth colony's legal system was uniquely steeped in biblical law. In considering the historiography behind this contention, earlier sources claimed very simplistically that Plymouth's law and the laws of England were one and the same. Starting in the 1930s and ever since, with historian Julius Goebbels, scholarship on the legal history of Plymouth has taken a more nuanced approach, categorizing it as a Protestant theocracy, a colony of biblicism, and a government built on biblical law. From the 1940s through the present, historians have reaffirmed this idea that Plymouth relied on and made literal use of the Bible in forming their political system. In applying this framework, recent legal scholarship has specifically looked to Granger's case as a prime example of law, a biblical law in Plymouth colony. In recognizing the inherent differences between the 17th century English common law system and Plymouth's legal system, this scholarship has used notions of biblicism as an explaining factor in this discrepancy. Even today, legal treatises look to Goebbels' article from the early 1930s as the primary source of authority on law and religion in Plymouth. Yet this longstanding scholarly conclusion is unsupported by a modern reading of Plymouth's legal history, and thus is well deserving of reconsideration today. A reinterpreted understanding of Plymouth's legal system and its relationship to biblical law depends on an understanding of the foundations of both Plymouth's legal and political origins, as well as its intersection with its religious origins. At the religious center of Plymouth was separatism. This sect of Reformed Protestantism posited that the only true form of Christianity lay, quote, in the simplicity of the gospel, devoid of the offices, callings, courts, and canons, end quote, found in the Roman Catholic or Anglican churches. To separatists, any display of Christianity that did not conform with a literal reading of the Bible was an anti-Christian practice. The religious foundations of Plymouth flow naturally into its political ones, yet are not the only explanation of its origins. Just as Plymouth's laws have been wrongly cast in an overly religious light, so too has the understanding of the colony's political foundation overemphasized the importance of religion on its origins. The story of Plymouth began in the north of England, where local groups of separatists gathered in secrecy, including William Brewster, whose son, Love Brewster, would one day employ Thomas Granger. To escape the growing orthodoxy of the Church of England under King James I, evident by the arrests of some of the congregation for their religious dissent, many fled to Leyden in the Netherlands. From Leyden, they worked in tandem with the London Company and Thomas Weston to obtain a patent for land in North America. Though driven by religious principles, Plymouth thus began as a joint stock corporation. Despite harsh winters and food shortages, they established a working colony. Surrounded by a pale of wooden spikes, the colony consisted of some 20 houses set along a hillside. At the peak of this hill stood a wooden fort that served as the seat of government, its court, and the austere place of worship alike. From this humble building, the entire legal history of Plymouth colony was forged. The legal structures that surrounded Plymouth, and in turn Granger's case, were in a hierarchical progression. English law was the king's law, and from the king, power over the colony passed to the London Company through its charter, which gave the colony the power to make its own laws and ordinances. Acting on this autonomy, the governor and his assistants put in place dozens of acts and statutes within the first several decades of the colony, guaranteeing such things as the right to trial by jury, the use of oaths, and the election of the governor and his assistants by all eligible men in the colony, mirroring English custom. The structure of the courts at Plymouth, to be sure, varied widely from the English system with its very strict variety of courts, but despite notable differences, the acts soon expressed a clear intention of maintaining laws, quote, according to the precedents of the laws of England as near may be, end quote. Thus, while the structure of the colony was more simplified in its legal system, the basic goals of the colony as outlined in their own words were to maintain a legal system that was fundamentally English. Having outlined the religious origins and legal foundations of Plymouth and their intersection, we return to the life of Thomas Granger. Though born sometime between 1625 and 1627, many specific details of his early life remain lost. Granger, his parents, and his siblings are listed among the passengers of a ship called the Hercules, which sailed on June the 9th, 1637, from Kent, England to Boston, carrying with it John Harvard, whose name still graces the university. By the early 1640s, he was a servant at Duxbury to Love Brewster, one of the most well-connected men in all of Plymouth colony, whose reputation likely descended into infamy by the acts of his servants. These low and depraved acts, thankfully, may be very briefly told. Over some months in the summer of 1642, Granger committed sexual acts, which the records later described by the term buggery, with no fewer than a dozen animals. His crimes came to an end when he was caught by an unnamed witness in July of 1642. Arrested, he remained in the custody of John Holmes, assistant to the court, his fate to be adjudicated thereafter. To deal with such an unusual crime, both the civil and legal structures of the colony came together to discuss potential consequences. The first legal question at issue in Granger's case was whether his act could be considered a capital offense under the laws of the colony. This was an issue of first impression for the court. The colony's charter, of course, provided little indication of what could be done in a case such as this, beyond the right of the colonies to enact their own laws and their promises to follow the precedents of England. The laws created as of 1642 did state that buggery was an offense liable to death, but it likewise said that such unclean acts were to be punished at the discretion of the magistrates. This meant that the statute alone was not dispositive. Moreover, as of 1642, no case similar to Granger's had come before the court, leaving the legal authorities of the colony without substantive guidance. Therefore, they turned to the colony's highest moral authority, their religious elders, not as a principal source of law, but rather as a last resort on the legality of the question presented. In deciding whether Granger's acts were punishable by death, elders John Rayner, Ralph Patridge, and Charles Chansey turned to the book of Leviticus. The relevant verse, according to the 1599 Geneva Bible, with which the Plymouth colonists had brought with them from England, dictates that, quote, "Thou shalt not lie with any beast, for it is an abomination. The man that lieth with beast shall die the death, and ye shall slay the beast," end quote. In applying this law to Granger's case, they concluded that his acts could warrant punishment by death under this aspect of Levitical law, so long as he was convicted by a jury according to English custom. Without further authority, the structures of the colony relied on the Bible and infused religion into their legal system, not as a principal or primary source in shaping their law, but rather to fill in the gaps where the colony's law was silent. They even tempered their reading of the Bible with references to the colony's English-based customs on jury trials. With the substance decided, they now had a crime and a punishment, but they still needed a confession. In deciding against the use of torture, in obtaining such a confession, the elders applied the maxim nemo tenetur prodere se ipsum, Latin for "no one is bound to give themselves up," which Bradford had written down for them in his quest. Unlike their decisions about punishment, two of the three elders relied on this Latin maxim, a common mode of legal analysis, while the third only made passing references to biblical passages. This use of legal reasoning again demonstrates that the Bible was a last resort and even gave way where clear legal maxims provided sufficient conclusions. The final decision to be rendered before Granger could be brought to the court was whether the conviction could stand with only a single witness. The elders advised on this point that a single witness, in addition to his confession, could be sufficient to uphold a conviction. Unlike prior issues, here they go against biblical law despite citing biblical texts. According to biblical law, quote, "At the mouth of two witnesses shall a matter be established." Given how frequently the theme of two witnesses is referenced in the Bible, it is unsurprising the elders were familiar with it. However, they went directly against this in allowing Granger's case to proceed with only a single witness in accusation. Thus, the full picture of the procedure of Granger's case reveals not only the Bible's lack of centrality, but also that biblical teachings gave way where they conflicted with the laws of England or the laws of the colony in matters of judicial reasoning. With the legal questions resolved to the satisfaction of the elders and the governor, Granger was brought before the court. Though he initially denied his accusation, he eventually confessed to his acts. Sometime shortly on or before September the 7th, 1642, at the age of approximately 15, Granger stood near the center of Plymouth, just south of the town meeting house, the same building which served as the court and the church. There, assistants to Governor Bradford forced Granger to watch while the animal victims were killed, and Granger thereafter was hanged. For his services to the court, John Holmes was paid £2, 10 shillings. Thus, Granger's life, his criminal case, and the legal sources that shaped it came to a close. Having now demonstrated the status of the Bible not as a central source of authority, but rather a gap-filling source in Granger's case, the question before us remains where his case fits within the broader context of Plymouth's laws, as well as the laws of England. In Plymouth, crimes similar though less extreme to Granger's were almost always addressed by sources of other legal authority, not references to the Bible. In England, likewise, there were some instances of biblical citations in contemporaneous court records, but showing that Plymouth was far from an outlier in using biblical sources, even if infrequently. In a similarly shocking case in Plymouth's earlier years, and the first execution of an Englishman in the colony, was the murder of John Newcomen by John Billington. But here, a lack of novel legal question meant that applying biblical law was absent in the court records of Billington's case. In brief, John Newcomen, a servant, crossed into Billington's lands, and in defense, Billington raised his musket and fired a single shot, killing Newcomen instantly. Billington was arraigned and brought before the court and found guilty, and thereafter was hanged. But despite his trial being the first capital crime ever committed in the colony, the reasoning behind Billington's execution, as laid out by Governor Bradford and his assistants, make no references to biblical law, as Bradford and the other religious men of learning could have easily made for a murder trial. One needs only think of the story of Cain and Abel to realize that. A lack of novel or unique legal questions in later cases similar to Granger's also meant that biblical references in deciding crimes and punishments are equally absent. In 1681, Thomas Settler was accused of a nearly identical crime as Thomas Granger had 40 years earlier. The jury found him guilty, but they made no reference to biblical justification in their records. Granger's case had settled the law some 40 years earlier, and thus required no further use of the Bible to fill in gaps in legal authority. In other similar cases contemporaneous to Granger's, biblical references equally remain rare. In 1636, John Alexander and Thomas Roberts were found guilty of lewd behavior and were sentenced to be whipped, where the case only relies on the statute. Again, in 1639, Mary Mondam was convicted of adultery, and she too was sentenced only according to the statute. As with prior cases, the court made no biblical references and relied only on statutory text. Thus, where the colony's laws provided the court with sufficient foundations to punish the accused, references to religious justifications in shaping their legal and political system was absent. Finally, just as the records of crimes similar to Granger's, either in their novelty or in their similarity to his acts, reveal a lack of reliance on biblical sources, so too do the records of English law of the period reflect only a similarly occasional use of biblical references. The earliest legislation on buggery in England, the crime for which Granger was accused, came with a, quote, act for the vice of the punishment of buggery during the reign of King Henry VIII in 1533. By the 17th century, case records reflected an abundantly clear application of this statute and its religious undertones. A prime example comes with the case in 1608 of the Crown against Humphrey Stafford, which noted that the moral foundations of this statute rested on Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. This case highlights a direct reference to the very same biblical passages as in Granger's case, a mere 3 decades earlier, where the Bible comes not as a central source, but rather a secondary justification for the statute. Referring to this case, jurist Sir Edward Coke provides a remarkably analogous reference to Levitical law in his Institutes, published in England circa 1644, a mere 2 years after Granger's execution. As with Granger's case, Coke's reference to biblical law is present, yet this is not his primary justification in defining the statute, and rather an ancillary justification, placing a flourish on the legal reasoning he presents. In sum, it was long claimed that Plymouth Colony was a colony deeply rooted in biblical law in its political and legal system. From the story of Thomas Granger, situated in its greater context, this contention gives way to the realities of the colony's legal system. The story of Thomas Granger represents a glimpse into the use of the Bible in criminal punishment. Yet the use of Leviticus in his case is best understood not as a central tenet of law, but a last resort in a case that was as shocking and legally intricate for the colony's fledgling criminal justice system. In comparison to the laws of the colony as a whole and the contemporaneous jurisprudence of England, it becomes clear that biblicism is not a central explaining factor in shaping Plymouth's legal system. Today, questions over the relationship between religion and law in America's earliest settlements profoundly shape legal scholars' views of law up to the present, whether in analyzing the use of the Bible in modern legal reasoning, the placement of the Ten Commandments in a courthouse, or the very nature of religious freedom in our constitutional jurisprudence. These remain as relevant to our law as the grave question of how to punish Thomas Granger did in September of 1642. And with that, I thank you all for your attention, and that completes the first conference paper I've ever presented.
Thank you so much, Liam. Before we proceed, let me give Liam his due introduction here. So Liam is a second-year JD MA in History candidate at Boston University School of Law, let's not make that confusion. As a graduate student, Liam specializes in American history and is broadly interested in the legal and economic history of 17th and 18th century New England. His research focuses on the relationship between English common law and the legal system in colonial New England, the effects of Greco-Roman history and Protestant Christianity on colonial American law, and the political relationships between English and Dutch colonies in what is now the Northeastern United States. So thank you very much, Liam. Appreciate your presentation. Our next presenter is Adam Waters. Adam is a doctoral candidate in modern American history at Yale University. His dissertation, tentatively titled Faith in Liberation, the Inter-American Religious Left and the Politics of Transnational Activism, 1968 to 2000, examines the intersecting trajectories of faith-based activists in the United States and Latin America in the second half of the 20th century, with particular attention to transnational solidarities around liberation theology, anti-dictatorship and human rights organizing, and the provision of sanctuary. Today, Adam will be presenting a paper entitled The Liberationist in Exile, Father Sergio Torres and the Search for North American Theologies of Liberation. So Adam, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Thanks to the organizers, especially to Zach and Father Massa, and to the other panelists as well, for what I'm sure will be a really rich discussion. All right, I will get into it. So in August 1975, around 200 Christians from across the Western Hemisphere gathered in Detroit, Michigan for a convening known as Theology in the Americas. And the purpose of the conference, as laid out by its Chilean Catholic Socialist organizer, Father Sergio Torres. I'm hearing some echo. Anyone else hearing that? Okay, great. Was to quote, explore theologically the significance of liberation theology for Christians in the United States, end quote. So among those in attendance at the conference were 25 Latin Americans, featuring such prominent names in liberation theology as Gustavo Gutierrez, Hugo Asman, Leonardo Boffi, Jose Miguel Bonino, and Beatriz Melano Couch, the only female liberation theologian in attendance. And the 175 North Americans came from the United States and Canada, and were an ecumenical group including professional theologians, lay activists, social workers, and blue-collar workers. Over the course of several days, these individuals discussed and debated how new Christian theological currents arising throughout the Americas could advance liberation from the oppressions of racism, sexism, classism, and imperialism. At the heart of this discussion, as Torres suggested, was the question of the usefulness of Latin American liberation theology in the US context. So the core tenets of liberation theology had emerged in the writings of various South American theologians starting in the late 1960s, and by the 1970s, liberation theology had become one of the dominant theological approaches across much of Latin America. So just to give a brief explanation of liberation theology, right? So one of the main tenets of liberation theology was the methodological claim that theology was a reflective exercise performed only after one had already been engaged in work to transform the social and political reality. In other words, that doing theology under the liberation theology paradigm was the second step rather than the first. And another important tenet was the argument that the core message of the Bible was that God intervened on the side of the poor and the oppressed, a preferential option for the poor, right? And that Christians therefore had an obligation to join in collective struggle for liberation. As liberation theology grew in importance in Latin America, it also came to shape US Christianity through a variety of means, including interpersonal relationships between Latin American and US theologians, the publication of works of liberation theology by US-based printing houses like Orbis Books, run by the Marinals, and stories shared by returning missionaries and visitors to the region. But additionally important, though largely overlooked, I argue, was a series of ecumenical efforts to forge transnational communities of dialogue and exchange around liberation theology, led in particular by Torres, who had come to the United States as an exile in the mid-1970s. Building on the conversations at the 1975 Detroit conference, Torres launched a larger project also called Theology in the Americas to promote Latin American liberation theology in the United States and to assist US Christians in devising new theologies of liberation responsive to their particular political, social, and economic needs. And so I want to use Torres's work to kind of trace the connections between left-wing Christians or radical Christians in the US and Latin America at this time the significance of their intellectual collaboration as well as their disagreement, and also the continued impact of the liberationist spirit of the 1970s on Christian political engagement in the following decades. I also think that recovering the history of theology in the Americas can help us kind of open up new ways of thinking about the intersections of religion and politics in the late 20th century United States. So, traditionally, the most prominent narrative within the historiography on American religion in the period, in this period, the late 20th century, has been the story of the rise of the new religious or the new Christian right. So scholars have talked about the white Christian backlash against the civil rights movement, the relationship between conservative evangelicalism and free market capitalism, the emergence of the so-called culture wars in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think particularly noteworthy in recent years has been the transnational turn in the study of religion and conservative politics. And so I'm thinking here of works by scholars like Melanie McAllister, Lauren Turek, Ben Cowan, Augusta Del Olmo, and others who have explored how conservative US Christians built international networks, especially with their counterparts in the global South, to further their political and religious agendas. And so, what I want to do here is try to take that transnational turn and think about it in relation to Christians who identified with the left or with progressive politics. And in particular, my research suggests that the encounter with Latin American liberation theology in the 1970s and 1980s transformed US theology and religious activism, reorienting many US Christians toward an internationalist vision in which Christian radicals would work together across national borders to promote an anti-imperial, anti-militarist, anti-capitalist, and anti-racist politics. I think this Christian left internationalism was connected to, but in important ways distinct from, the revolutionary internationalism that was popular on the secular left in the 1970s. So I'll start now by thinking particularly about Sergio Torres and his origins. So Sergio Torres was working as a priest in the city of Talca, about 150 miles south of Santiago, in 1970, when Chile embarked on a radically new political path. Salvador Allende, a physician and member of the Socialist Party of Chile, won the presidential election as the head of the left-wing Unidad Popular, or Popular Unity Coalition. Allende promised to guide Chile down a democratic road to socialism, what he called the Via Chilena. Torres had not voted for Allende. He had actually cast a ballot for the candidate of the Christian Democratic Party in the 1970 elections, who had himself run a fairly left-wing campaign. But Torres was one of a number of Catholic priests who were radicalized by Allende's victory. Socialism, once feared as antithetical to Christianity, now seemed to provide the surest avenue to liberate Chile's poor and marginalized in a way that this group of priests saw as concordant with the spirit of the gospel. This growing sense among left-wing priests in Chile that socialism and Christianity not only were compatible, but that in fact to be a good Christian demanded that one also opt for socialism, culminated in the creation of the group Christians for Socialism, or Cristianos por el Socialismo, CPS, in 1971. And Torres was one of its central leaders. Over the next 2 years, CPS became a vibrant space of dialogue among radical Christians from Chile and beyond, as well as a base from which they could work to further the struggle for socialism. Around 400 individuals, 250 of them priests, attended the first Latin American meeting of Christians for Socialism held in Santiago in April 1972. And the message from the conference clearly reflected the influence of liberation theology on the growing number of Latin American Christian socialists. So, a statement from the conference said, quote, "The spirit of Christ resurrected is today as active as ever, driving history, revealing itself in solidarity, in the selfless dedication of those that fight for liberty, in true love for their oppressed brothers," end quote. After a right-wing military coup orchestrated by Augusto Pinochet overthrew the Allende government on September 11, 1973, the new dictatorship cracked down on all expressions of radical politics. Leaders of CPS were abducted, tortured, and killed. And Torres was one of many who were forced into exile. He eventually ended up in the United States, where he quickly established relationships with groups on the sort of left liberal wing of the US Catholic Church, among them the Marinol, a group of missionary priests and nuns active in Latin America, who had been among the first to embrace Latin American liberation theology in their work, in their missionary work, as well as the Center for Concern, a think tank jointly established in 1971 by the Jesuits and the National Conference of Catholic Bishops to advance Catholic social teaching. Seeing in Exile an opportunity to further the work initiated by CPS, Torres hatched the idea in 1974 of organizing a meeting of Latin American and North American theologians to discuss liberation theology. He quickly found support for the proposal among a wide array of Christian organizations, both Catholic and Protestant, including many of the leading mainline Protestant denominations, and a conference was planned for August 1975. Early planning documents for the conference conceived of the meeting as primarily interested in taking Latin American liberation theology and applying it to the US context, right? Sort of exploring how Latin American liberation theology could be exported to the United States. Specifically, these documents suggested that liberation theology could help US Christians to overcome the, quote, naive religious vision of American innocence, end quote, that had legitimized the expansion of American empire in the name of Christian destiny. The conference, in other words, would allow US theologians to learn from their counterparts in Latin America and bring liberation theology's insights as well as its anti-imperial implications into their own writing and teaching. As the call to participate went out to many of the United States' leading liberal and left-wing theologians, however, the response was mixed. Some were concerned that the conference was geared primarily toward professional theologians at the expense of poor and working-class lay people. Others worried that starting from the basis of Latin American liberation theology might perpetuate a focus on class struggle over and against other forms of oppression like racism and sexism. Rosemary Radford Ruther, the Catholic feminist theologian, wrote to Torres to express her frustration with what she saw as the excessively negative focus in the preparatory materials on the United States as an empire and on US Christianity as its validator. For Ruther, the problem was not the critique of the United States per se, but rather that the meeting might offer that critique without also providing some vision of resistance to American empire that was itself rooted in the nation's own history and mythos. Torres responded by broadening the scope of the project and increasing the avenues for input. In the year ahead of the convening, as many as 60 reflection groups were formed across the United States to review the preliminary documents and offer their own assessments about how to use the time together. Several papers were commissioned exploring how US Christianity and civil religion could provide tools for anti-imperial struggle. And the conference itself was structured so that the Latin American liberation theologians would present their research and findings on the first day, followed by several days devoted to analysis and reflection from US Black, Chicano, Indigenous, and feminist theologians. As the historian Lillian Caius-Barger has noted, despite this shift in preparation, the conference was racked by a number of questions, disagreements, and controversies, reflecting in part the different positionalities of the participants, as well as the complexity of trying to forge a conception of liberation that could transcend different political and cultural contexts. Two of the Black theologians in attendance, Herbert Edwards and James Cone, expressed their frustration with Latin American liberation theologians' lack of attention to race, and voiced their belief that the centrality and intensity of anti-Black oppression in the United States would make it difficult to forge a shared liberation theology across racial and national lines. By the end of the meeting, a number of identity-based caucuses had formed, indicative of the growing consensus that different forms of marginalization and exploitation would require different theological approaches. Still, many of the attendees sensed that these tensions and divisions, however real, were mainly just growing pains in the process of forging a new and more unified way of doing liberation theology across the Americas. So as the Presbyterian theologian and activist Robert McAfee Brown put it, the goal of the conference was to develop a theological approach rooted in, quote, the dialectic between particularity and global vision, end quote. In other words, it was to find a theological approach that could simultaneously hold an analysis of the specificities of different forms of oppression, as well as a shared commitment to justice and liberation. Whether seeing it as a success or a failure, the historians who have remarked on theology in the Americas have tended to leave the story with the Detroit Conference. But Torres had promised that the 1975 convening would be only the first in a longer series of dialogues and collaborations around liberation theology. In the aftermath of the conference at Detroit, Torres and his collaborators built a Theology in the Americas network to continue to deepen the relationships among liberationist Christians in the United States and Latin America, and to further the development of multiple theologies of liberation responsive to the particular needs of different marginalized communities. At its core, Theology in the Americas as a project was comprised of a series of interconnected working groups, including a Black theology project, a women's theology project, a Hispanic theology project, a professional theologians task force, and an alternative theology project for white Christians. There were also efforts to develop Native American, Asian American, and labor working groups under the Theology in the Americas umbrella as well. With the assistance of paid staffers supervised by Torres, mainly funded through the National Council of Churches, these groups worked largely autonomously on their own initiatives and events, sort of periodically meeting and sharing what they had been working on. And so with the remaining time, I want to say a little bit more about the Black Theology Project in particular, perhaps the most active of the projects under the Theology in the Americas umbrella. So the Black Theology Project, or BTP, was designed to build on the work already done to advance a Black theology of liberation by writers and theologians like James Cone. Participants and staff in the project included important Black and womanist theologians, so Cone, Gerard Wilmore, Muhammad Kenyatta, Sean Copeland, and Cornel West all moved through the project at various points in the 1970s and 1980s. The BTP called for the revival of the Black radical tradition within Black churches in a moment when national attention had begun to turn away from faith-based struggles for civil rights and racial equality. And although the BTP was primarily focused on developing Black liberation theology for the fight against anti-Black racism within the United States, I think it's also important to note that the BTP actively cultivated a third worldist internationalism, a sort of a vision of an interconnected global struggle against racism and classism that reflected both the encounters Black theologians had with Latin American liberationists through Theology in the Americas, as well, I think, the internationalist trajectory of secular Black radicalism in the 1970s. So some examples of this internationalism included that the BTP regularly facilitated discussions about liberation struggles in Puerto Rico, South Africa, and other places in the Global South. Cone and other BTP leaders worked with Torres to found the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, or ETWAT, a group that brought together liberationist Christians across the Global South and in oppressed communities in the Global North. And in the 1980s, the BTP participated in a series of dialogues in Cuba around Black liberation theology and revolutionary praxis. This turn toward doing theology in a transnational key was indicative not just of the BTP, but of the entire Theology in the Americas project. The central leadership team under Torres regularly made efforts to convene members of the network for trainings, reflections, and exchanges with Latin American liberation theologians. For example, a retreat held in November 1977 put Gustavo Gutierrez in dialogue with Bob Brown, Sean Copeland, president of New York Theological Seminary Bill Weber, future executive director of Amnesty International USA Gerhard Elston, and others on the topic of faith and political ideology. So then I would argue that Torres and Theology in the Americas served as a nexus for radical US and Latin American theological currents, building in the process a shared vocabulary of liberation and a vision of hemispheric solidarity. In August 1980, a second International Theology in the Americas conference was held in Detroit, this time with more than 500 people in attendance. Once again, tensions ran high at the conference, particularly between a coalition of non-white and indigenous people and the largely white organizers of the conference. While many of the Theology in the Americas working groups continued on after the convening, Torres's direct involvement decreased, and he later left the United States and returned to Latin America. Even after his departure from Theology in the Americas, however, the impact of his work and of the project's work in bringing Latin American liberation theology into US Christian radical circles remains. So just to give some sense of that, one person close to the project who had actually worked in Theology in the Americas was the Catholic activist Rene, who went on to found the Chicago Religious Task Force on Central America and serve as one of the principal leaders of the Sanctuary movement in the 1980s. And I think we'll hear more about the Sanctuary movement later today. Another person engaged in the Theology in the Americas project was Sister Margaret Mary Mavi Coakley, who worked for the Women's Coalition to stop U.S. intervention in Central America in the 1980s. So I think it's possible then to actually draw a direct line from theology in the Americas in the 1970s to the Central American Solidarity movement of the 1980s, right? And think about how liberation theology informed much Central American solidarity work in the 1980s, which was, I think, perhaps the largest and most successful display of left-wing activism in what was otherwise a fairly politically conservative decade. So just to wrap up then, this brief sketch of Torres and theology in the Americas emphasizes the need for more research about transnational and I think particularly Western hemispheric religious left activism in the 1970s and 1980s. Just as US Christian conservatives were looking abroad for allies in this period, so too were radical and liberationist Christians working to build global solidarity and promote international activism. Even as it inspired a range of debates and disagreements among Christians with different national, racial, gender, and class identities, liberation theology served as a point of convergence for what I would call an inter-American Christian left, as well as a source of inspiration and reflection for its efforts to resist dictatorship, combat imperialism, promote human rights, and build anti-capitalist alternatives. In recovering the experiences of this movement and of the role of liberation theology in shaping it, we can continue to shift late 20th century American religious historiography away from a focus on, we can sort of build out from a focus on the new Christian right and kind of reach toward a more dialectical narrative that recognizes the existence of multiple and competing religio-political traditions in the United States in the late 20th century. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Adam. We appreciate that very much. Our final presenter this afternoon is Dennis Weiboldt. He is a MA candidate in history here at Boston College. He's expected to graduate with his BA in history and theology from BC this year. His research focuses on the history of political thought and the influence of politico-religious theories on the American legal tradition and its historical development. Today, he will be presenting a paper entitled The Natural Law and Interreligious Political Advocacy, a Civil Rights Movement Case Study. So Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Zach, and thanks to our other two presenters for really interesting papers. So in his 1998 encyclical letter on the relationship between faith and reason, Fides et Ratio, Pope John Paul II remarked that philosophical thought is, quote, often the only ground for understanding and dialogue with those who do not understand our faith, end quote. Indeed, he continued, it is the task of Christian philosophers to, quote, develop a reflection which will be both comprehensible and appealing to those who do not yet grasp the full truth which divine revelation declares, because the most pressing issues facing humanity may possibly find a solution if there is a clear and honest collaboration between Christians and the followers of other religions, end quote. Informed by the Second Vatican Council's exhortation to exclude no one in the Christian's desire for dialogue, John Paul II rightly identified the role that philosophical thought can have in the building of interreligious partnerships for the amelioration of social ills. Though John Paul II promulgated Fides et Ratio after its de facto conclusion, the civil rights movement in the United States is an exemplar of how philosophical thought can be effectively used to build interreligious partnerships around important social issues. In particular, and as I hope to show today, appeals to the natural law were a particularly effective tool used by many American Catholic leaders during the civil rights movement to advance the cause of racial equality alongside those of other Christian and non-Christian traditions. In their presentation of racial discrimination as a principally moral issue violating the natural law, these religious leaders helped to catalyze the interreligious political advocacy necessary to achieve many of the major legislative successes of the period, especially the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. To understand how the natural law was used by Catholics during the civil rights movement, I suggest we turn to the work of William J. Keneally, a Jesuit priest and former dean of the Boston College Law School, who frequently engaged with those inside and outside of the Catholic tradition through the prism of the natural law. As demonstrated by his scholarship and ministry, Keneally continually emphasized a twofold relationship between the natural law and civil rights. First, that the natural law, as a fundamentally philosophical principle, can be accessed by individuals of any religious disposition through the use of pure human reason to understand the objective moral truth of racial equality. And second, that the natural law, because it is the foundation of American civil law, must be integrated into the civil law. including in its protection of racial equality. In these ways, we can begin to see that Keneally understood the natural law to both evidence the end of the civil rights movement, racial equality, and suggest the means for achieving this end, the construction and maintenance of civil rights laws. Importantly, Keneally understood that politically achieving this end would require the employment of principles to which those of multiple religious faiths could respond, not least because the American polity's multi-religious character at mid-century meant that the most effective political coalitions would likely be the most interreligious. As such, Keneally's formulation of a twofold relationship between the natural law and civil rights again was crucial. In the first instance, the natural law, as a philosophical tool accessible to all, was well suited to serve as the foundation for interreligious political advocacy. And in the second instance, the natural law, because it provides the foundation for American civil law, too provided a sustained incentive for Americans to engage in the interreligious political advocacy that would make concrete in the civil law that which the natural law had always known. In concluding my presentation, I will moreover suggest that Keneally was not alone amongst American Catholic leaders in believing that appealing to the natural law was one of the most effective methods for interreligious coalition building. Indeed, by briefly examining the drafting of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference's 1958 Pastoral Letter on Racial Equality, Discrimination, and Christian Conscience, we will see that the natural law was one of American Catholic leaders' preferred methods of bringing those of different religious traditions together to politically realize the civil rights movement's highest ideals. After graduating from Boston College, Weston College, the Gregorian University in Rome, and Georgetown University with an undergraduate degree and 4 graduate degrees, Keneally was named Dean of the Boston College Law School, a position which he held between 1939 and 1956. Leveraging his extensive academic background, Keneally's deanship earned him a reputation as a respected legal scholar, progressive social reformer, and skilled administrator, especially amongst Catholic observers. Although Keneally's deanship is often overshadowed by that of his successor, Robert Drinan, the Jesuit priest later elected to Congress, it was Keneally who led the law school's efforts to recruit veterans to the legal profession and allow, for the first time ever, women's admittance to the law school. Despite Keneally's many successes as dean, he left Boston College in 1956 for a visiting professorship at Loyola University of New Orleans. While in New Orleans, one of his most important assignments was delivering the sermon at the 1956 Red Mass, an annual liturgy marking the beginning of the legal term. Given the high-profile nature of this sermon and the fact that it marked Keneally's most concrete public entrance into the civil rights movement, a close analysis of the sermon will help us understand how Keneally thought the natural law could be a helpful tool for the building of an interreligious pro-civil rights coalition, one well-disposed to undertake political action that could concretely realize the civil rights movement's highest ideals. Amidst the backdrop of Montgomery bus boycott and post-Brown v. Board civil rights landscape, Keneally's sermon sought to articulate an uppercase and lowercase c Catholic approach to understanding the moral problem of racial discrimination. Delivered at the St. Louis Cathedral before an audience of well-respected Catholic and non-Catholic legal practitioners, the sermon appealed to fundamental values recognized by the Declaration and Constitution, but values only intelligible in light of the natural law. Not so serendipitously, in fact, the sermon began with an excerpt from the Declaration, but asserted that democratic governments must ultimately be oriented around the, quote, real end of a just and ordered liberty, end quote, a liberty determined in form and scope by the natural law. In this vein, after acknowledging the dangers of majoritarianism, Keneally exhorted his audience to respect that the American polity is bound to conform to, quote, the objective moral order, end quote. In Keneally's mind, this order, as established by the natural law, provided certain inalienable rights equally to all, including racial equality. Thus, these rights were to be protected through the, quote, construction and maintenance of a civil code of laws which embraces, complements, and applies the principles of the natural law to civic life, end quote. At this juncture, we can already see the connection that Keneally was articulating between the natural law and interreligious political advocacy. In other words, of how the natural law evidenced the end of the civil rights movement and suggested a means for achieving this end. Indeed, in Keneally's formulation, because the end of the civil law must be the protection of those rights endowed to all by the natural law, it was the responsibility of Americans to create civil laws that achieved the end of a just and ordered liberty, as prescribed by the natural law. In the civil rights context, of course, this meant that Keneally believed that the natural law could not only help Catholics and non-Catholics understand the objective truth of fundamental human equality and its inextricability from the requirements of a just and ordered liberty, but also that the natural law, because of its universal accessibility, would encourage those of many faith traditions to undertake the common political activities necessary to ensure this principle of the natural law was also evident in the civil law. As we've seen, central to Keneally's connection between American law and civil rights was that the natural law, which, quote, offers adequate reason for the essential equality of all men, to provide a rational and spiritual basis for our rights and liberties, end quote. Consequently, Keneally's sermon set a foundation for his participation in the building of an interreligious anti-discrimination movement, insofar as he argued that the philosophy of the natural law, which endows all of humanity with equality, was also, quote, the philosophy upon which this nation was founded, end quote. In this way, even a religiously disestablished nation like the United States was bound to conform to the natural law's understanding of fundamental human equality, a challenge to Americans of all religious inclinations to undertake political activities that would make clear in the civil law that which the natural law had always known. So by this point, it's clear that Keneally understood the natural law to provide a non-sectarian philosophical foundation for racial equality, what I've termed the end of the civil rights movement. Now we must turn to whether Keneally's connected belief that appeals to the natural law could provide a means to politically actualize this end was well-founded. To evaluate this question, let us now turn to the reaction to his 1956 sermon. After its delivery, Keneally's sermon was published and republished numerous times. In 1957, for example, the sermon appeared in the Catholic Mind, a popular Catholic periodical. Additionally, the sermon was reprinted as an unpublished pamphlet and distributed to numerous academics. In a letter to the then Archbishops of New Orleans, in fact, Keneally listed many of the reputable scholars and practitioners who offered personal compliments on the sermon, including the Archbishop of Boston, 2 US Supreme Court justices, 2 Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court justices, the deans of the Harvard, Yale, Fordham, Georgetown, Catholic University, Detroit University, and Howard University law schools, and professors from these institutions, and 13 more. Moreover, over 2,000 copies of the sermon were procured by Loyola University and a personal friend, and an additional 25,000 copies of the sermon were printed and distributed by the Fund for the Republic, with the hopes that it would, quote, prove instructive to those who receive it, end quote. Admittedly, many of those who wrote to Keneally were Catholic. Indeed, as part of his planning of the 1958 National Conference of the Catholic Interracial Councils, well-known Jesuit civil rights activist John Lafarge asked Keneally if he would be willing to deliver an address similar to his 1956 Red Mass sermon that could, quote, place the theoretical principles of interracial justice from the standpoint of Catholic faith and the natural law clearly before the public. As I've suggested, however, Keneally's sermon was well received far beyond Catholic circles. A few additional examples will be demonstrable. In a February 1957 letter to Keneally, Louisiana State law professor Wex Malone described Keneally's sermon as a, quote, magnificent address, end quote, adding that a Quaker organization had mailed it to him, a Unitarian. Despite acknowledging that he and Keneally were at, quote, opposite religious poles in a few outward respects, end quote, Malone wrote that, again quoting, the segregation problem can be solved only by moving the spirits of men, end quote. Certainly an ode to the importance of broad interreligious attention to the moral problem of de jure racial discrimination. Professor Malone's reaction to Keneally's sermon was paradigmatic for how Keneally's natural law-rooted presentation of racial discrimination continued to catalyze his contributions to the making of an interreligious civil rights movement. Indeed, while Catholics like Lafarge frequently complimented Keneally for his ability to connect racial discrimination to the natural law, those of other religious dispositions also found Keneally's sermon impactful, often because of the non-exclusivist way that Keneally presented the issue of racial equality. In 1959, for example, Keneally was invited by Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, president of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, to the Union's 45th General Assembly because of Keneally's experience in, quote, interreligious and human relations programs, end quote. In particular, Eisendrath hoped that Keneally could provide his thoughts to the Union on whether, quote, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are able to work together effectively and on what issues, including on the racial issues, end quote. In a similar way, after Keneally appeared on the National Council of Catholic Men's Church of the Air program in 1961 to deliver a civil rights address nearly identical to his 1956 sermon, Keneally received complimentary letters from Catholics and non-Catholics, reflecting a broad multi-faith appeal that made him the council's most popular radio star ever. and that prompted his talk to, quote, draw more audience mail than the council ever had received from Church on the Air, end quote. The effective role that Keneally-esque natural law appeals had in the building of interreligious partnerships during the civil rights movement is further reflected in the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference's 1958 pastoral letter on racial equality. Described by the Journal of Negro Education in 1959 as, quote, one of the more articulate pronouncements which have been made by a number of religious groups in the last year, end quote, the Bishops' Conference letter marked an important moment in the American Church's articulation of how the faithful should respond to the civil rights movement. While it's difficult, based on the archival material, to ascertain Keneally's particular impact on the 1958 statement's drafting, his private writings demonstrate that he was in close conversation with those involved in the drafting process, some of whom had expressed familiarity with and appreciation of Keneally's work. Thus, reading the bishop's statement in light of Keneally's 1956 sermon demonstrates that the natural law-informed approach to promoting interreligious political advocacy that Keneally manifested in his sermon was officially endorsed by the American Church's hierarchy in discrimination and Christian conscience, setting a nationwide standard for how Catholics were to approach the civil rights movement. In this vein, I want to focus on three particular passages from the bishop's statement. Quoting here from the statement, quote, even those who do not accept our Christian tradition should at least acknowledge that God has implanted in the souls of all men some knowledge of the natural moral law and respect for its teachings. Reason alone taught philosophers through the ages respect for the sacred dignity of each human being and the fundamental rights of man, end quote. This understanding that there are certain foundational truths about the universe that individuals of any religious disposition can recognize is exactly what Keneally had expressed in his Red Mass sermon. As such, the bishops, like Keneally, offered an invitation for interreligious political advocacy on the issue of civil rights insofar as both agreed that irrespective of one's particular religious affiliation, the natural law's existence and mandate for racial equality reigned supreme. In other words, Keneally and the bishops agreed that the natural law evidenced the end of the civil rights movement, racial equality. Another common thread between Keneally's work and that of the bishops can be found in the sense that both Keneally and the bishops understood the civil law to be predicated on the natural law. Quoting again from the statement, from these solemn truths, there follows certain conclusions vital for a proper approach to the problems that trouble us today. First, we must repeat the principle embodied in our Declaration of Independence that all men are equal in the sight of God. By equal, we mean that they are created by God and redeemed by his divine Son, that they are bound by his law, and that God desires them as his friends in the eternity of heaven. This fact confers upon all men human dignity and human rights, end quote. As we see in this excerpt, just as Keneally's sermon articulated his belief that the natural law's foundational relationship to the civil law required the undertaking of political action to bring the civil law ever more fully into accordance with the natural law, the bishop's statement also suggests, even if in more implicit language, that Americans indeed have the right under the natural law, and thus ought to have the right under the civil law to fundamental human equality. In this way, to say that appeals to the natural law were a preferred method amongst American Catholic leaders for building interreligious partnerships is quite faithful to the history of the civil rights movement. In the bishop's concluding remarks, they wrote, quote, we hope and earnestly pray that responsible and sober-minded Americans of all religious faiths in all areas of our land will seize the mantle of leadership from the agitator and the racist. It is vital that we act now and act decisively. All must act quietly, courageously, and prayerfully before it is too late, end quote. Here again, the bishops, just as Keneally, demonstrated an understanding that appeals to the natural law founded right to racial equality were an interreligious invitation to undertake concrete action that would make known in the civil law that which the natural law had always attested to. Consequently, I think it's safe to say that American leaders in this moment had a well-founded belief that the natural law evidenced the end of the civil rights movement, racial equality, and suggested an effective means for achieving this end, the construction and maintenance of civil rights laws. Thus, within this twofold formulation, we see importantly that interreligious activism among the American Catholic faithful during the mid-20th century could be intimately tied to effective political change, especially through the use of natural law appeals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, and thanks to all of our presenters. I'll now turn the floor over to Father Massa for his response.
Thanks to all three of you. I really enjoyed reading these papers. They were provocative in the best sense, and I actually learned quite a bit. So what I want to do is give you my questions to all three of you right now, so you can have a little bit of time to think without doing this quickly on your feet. I will do it in the order which you presented, and then you can answer all of my questions or part of my questions or none of my questions, depending on what you want to do. And then we can open it up. I think Dan, who comes to us from Harvard, might have some questions about the Unitarian stuff involved in all this. On page 11, Liam, you said, this is a quote from what you say, the legal structures of the colony, referring to Plymouth colony, relied on religious authority not as a principal or dominant source of the law, but rather to fill in the gaps in the colony's laws. Okay, probably true. I'm not a Puritan historian. I've read a lot of Puritanism, but probably true. Now, as you probably know, Samuel Eliot Morison, Perry Miller, David Hall, I did my doctorate at Harvard, so I read all the dead white men and their positions on Puritanism. They all describe Plymouth as a theocracy, okay? Most recently, David Hall, even though his book looks at the Puritans, as background, he talks about the Plymouth colony. And as you know, the Plymouth was not a Puritan colony, it was a separatist colony, somewhat different thing. It all comes down to how you define theocracy, doesn't it? Is theocracy a government by God? Is a theocracy a government by the Bible? Is a theocracy a government by the godly? So depending on which one, how you want to define theocracy, the answer will be different. So was Plymouth governed by God directly? Was it governed directly by the Bible? Or was it governed directly by the godly, who claimed to be, who separated from the Church of England precisely for deeply religious purposes? What role specifically does separatism, they were separating Congregationalists, unlike the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, what role did separatism play in setting up a godly commonwealth? I guess the third question I have for you, Liam, is are you trying to disprove that Plymouth was a theocracy, or are you trying to focus more clearly on how it was a theocracy, or how the godly people of Plymouth understood themselves to be under God's law and under the rule of the Bible? So I'll come back to that. Okay. Adam, I really liked your paper about the effect of Latin American theology. Now, as you know, Protestant Christians in this country had a revered tradition that emerged in the 1880s and 90s called the social gospel movement, which probably had one of the biggest effects in American culture generally by the Men in Religion Forward movement, which had a big effect on social stuff. So the social gospel tradition pretty much defined, I would say, progressive mainstream Protestantism, those groups that we used to call the Seven Sisters, the seven progressive, big, largely white Protestant churches that do it. So there was a tradition of social Christianity, and even of radical, as advanced by people like George Heron, in Christian socialism, well before the 20th century. So did what you describe in terms of this movement started by Torres, did it build for the Protestants? I guess I'm asking, did Torres's movement build on that social gospel tradition, or did it replace that tradition with something else? Now, as you also probably know, Latin American liberation theology has really divided the American Catholic community between left and right. So lefties like myself are always referring to Latin American liberation theology. People on the other end of the spectrum view this as deeply suspect. Indeed, as you know, Pope John Paul II put out an encyclical about this, condemning certain aspects of liberation theology as Marxist and therefore deeply dangerous. Did this movement do the same thing in the Protestant churches? I mean, did it divide Protestant Christians? Now, almost all the missions in Latin America were by evangelical Protestants, not by the Seven Sisters denominations. So there was no tradition of regular conversations with people in Latin America. What effect did that introduction of all this stuff have on the mainstream? Especially, I would suspect, now Dan can correct me here, I suspect for Unitarians and Congregationalists, it probably had a big effect. But what effect did it have on Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans and Episcopalians, if any? I don't know. sort of like, but I'd be interested to find out. Now, Dennis and I have been on this hobby horse of natural law for a couple of years. He's been in a couple of courses of mine. So I'm convinced that Dennis has discovered the crucial figure of Father Keneally, a Jesuit, started out at Boston College, was so radical, as a matter of fact, that he was fired by the then Jesuit president of Boston College, which is the reason why he went to Loyola New Orleans, and was the predecessor to the famous Father Drinan, who became, a U.S. official elected to Congress by this, by our Chestnut Hill's largely Jewish population. I guess I have a question for you, Dennis, on how the Protestants and Jews who read Keneally's speech, the Red Mass, and subsequent sermons, what did they make of natural law? I mean, to me, it's always natural. As you know, I'm deeply suspicious of neo-Thomist natural law, things that this can be understood by everyone. Well, how come only Catholics get it? Do Catholics have better natural law genes than other people? I mean, like why is it that it's really evolved into something like Catholic speech? So and you uncovered a lot of evidence that lots of non-Catholics, Protestants, Jews, secular people wrote to Keneally congratulating him and saying that they found his speech moving and informative and important. What do you think they made of the specific theological foundational arguments that are part of natural law, especially at that time? I mean, as you know well, natural law today is in a completely different place. When we're talking about someone like Lisa Cahill, natural law is non-foundationalist and provisional. So we're talking about a different kind of natural law. But in those days, in the 1950s, this is pretty much a foundationalist natural law, just pretty clearly neo-Thomist. Did they understand this? And did they buy this, do you think? Or were they simply welcoming a new voice, that is the Catholic voice, who up to that point had been largely silent about the civil rights movement? So it could be Liam, Adam, Dennis, or in any order you want. So.
I'm happy to start if that would be fair, with giving Adam and Dennis equal amount of time to prepare with questions. And feel free, Father Massa, to interject at any point if you want me to clarify what I say. Starting with your first question, relating both to the historiography where you referenced Professor Miller, Professor Hall, as well as broadly defining theocracy. So I'll start on the historiography side. I do think, and of course, with only 20 minutes, I wasn't able to go as deeply into this, but there is certainly a divide between the way that historians, social historians, political historians have classified Plymouth, and then what legal scholars are doing. So the name I referenced in my presentation was Julius Goebbels, and he was a legal historian at Columbia, who in many ways he agreed with Miller at Harvard in defining Plymouth as a theocracy, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I do think some of the divide and where I was hoping for this to fit in, and hopefully as I continue to evolve it into a larger research project, is siding more with where legal scholars have fallen on this issue, and going even a step further in pushing back against that theocracy thesis that Miller and Hall and others have presented. In so far as defining theocracy is concerned, and that was something Professor Sipe had pushed me on in earlier versions of thinking about this research, I think the dividing line to my mind is, on the one hand, where a legal system is deriving its spirit or its ethos from religious foundations, biblical foundations. I mean, I think you would be intellectually dishonest to say that even our American system in punishing murder and robbery and rape don't, of course, derive some original understanding from Ten Commandment-esque biblical law. I think the step that scholars argue when they study Plymouth that I am looking to push back against is the idea that this bled over into the point that the actual legal texts and the legal procedure and the statutes that they were enacting were directly lifted from biblical interpretations. And I think that's the step that people like Perry Miller or Julius Goebbels took one too far in my mind. And I think that flows well into your second question about the role of separatism. And to be sure, separatism did influence the colony in every aspect of it, from its daily work life all the way up to its legal and political systems. But once again, tying your first and second questions together, I think the dividing line there is that separatism in contrast to Puritanism, which has been a lot more of what has been spoken about in defining, of course, Boston and Massachusetts Bay and their legal structures. There were two really key differences there. First of all, the Puritans in Boston were originally led by a lawyer. John Winthrop had been called to the bar, I believe, at the Middle Temple in London. So he had a much more robust legal training than someone like William Bradford. And I think in that sense, we see in Boston sources, though I'm not quite as familiar with them, a much more intricate connection between legal texts and biblical texts, what you might almost define as a theocracy, the way I laid it out earlier. Separatism, the other piece that really distinguishes it from the Puritans, is just how radically anti-hierarchical, anti-structure it was. The writings of the separatists, and I can say this having been raised a Catholic, really would put someone's hair on end the way they discuss Catholicism, the way they discuss any type of hierarchy, Anglicanism, just their real hatred for anything of religious structure.
I wrote a book on anti-Catholicism. I quote a lot of them. It's fun, actually. So it's
Yes.
yeah.
So in that sense, I think possibly another explanation that I don't go into the presentation, but might answer your where does separatism fit in, is I could see that anti-hierarchy compared to the Puritans also meaning that it's even less in Plymouth than scholars have given it credit for. Just to be brief and moving on to your last question about what I'm trying to prove and whether it's a lack of theocracy as I define it or whether it's redefining it. And I think to a point that I had made prior, there is, to be sure, a connection between law and religion and politics in Plymouth. Granger's case exemplifies that in how robustly they're quoting from the book of Leviticus. I think where my argument, and as I continue to shape it, is trying to fit within that, is saying that this wasn't the norm, that it wasn't their immediate go-to to say, we have a legal question, find a quote from Deuteronomy. It was only where there was something so aberrant, so morally difficult of a question, it was there that they finally resorted to, we have nothing else on which to resolve this, therefore biblical and religious moral-based justifications can fill in the gaps. So I hope that answers the three questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can go next. Thank you so much for these great questions. Yeah, I guess, so I think liberation theology as it relates to Latin American liberation theology as it relates to Protestants, I think the argument I'm trying to make is not that that liberation theology replaces the social gospel, but that I think it builds on and augments a kind of tradition of political activism or radical activism. And I think particularly what I'm trying to push at is the way in which it introduces a new kind of internationalism. And I think that comes at a particularly important moment when the missionary project, in the middle of the 20th century, the Protestant missionary project is sort of in crisis, is under question. Missionaries are interrogating the meaning and the value of missionary work, right? And liberation theology, I think, offers an alternative way to think about Christian internationalism, and particularly about, again, as I'm arguing, a sort of Western hemispheric or I guess not international, whatever, a hemispheric relationship and solidarity that I think is important for Protestants in the mid to late 20th century. So yeah, it's building on these earlier traditions, but I think also orienting them in new directions. And yeah, as to the question about if and how liberation theology divided mainline Protestants, I don't think that it provoked quite the level of kind of intensive conversation and debate as it did within the Catholic Church. But it is the case that liberation theology was a source of attack for conservative and even conservative Protestants, just as it was for conservative Catholics. And so, I'm thinking, for example, about the Institute on Religion and Democracy, formed in the early 1980s, and Richard Newhouse in the 80s is sort of already in the transition to becoming a neocon. And Newhouse regularly attacks liberation theology, and the IRD regularly sort of directs its attention toward liberation theology and toward trying to promote the relationship between liberation theology and communism among American Protestants, in addition to American Catholics. So there is definitely a conservative Protestant backlash against liberation theology, just like there's a conservative Catholic backlash. But I don't think it, at least so far, my research hasn't suggested that it sort of it becomes as intensely a kind of subject of attention within mainline Protestant hierarchy, like within mainline Protestant institutions, as it does within the Catholic Church. But yeah, Professor McKinnon might also have thoughts about that. Thanks so much again for the questions.
All right, so I think what was most surprising to me in my research, I came to Keneally's personal papers held here at BC because I was interested in interreligiosity in the mid-20th century. So I was surprised at how effective his appeals to the natural law were for non-Catholics. I mean, obviously there was a part of his, I think, the outlook on his ministry was that he was trying to convince Catholic at a crucial mid-century moment that racial equality was an important issue. So the natural law being something familiar in the Catholic vernacular certainly was helpful on that side. But the way he emphasized, the way he discussed the natural law emphasized a non-theological exclusivism that I think made it possible for those of other religious traditions to take it up. And, I see that through the invitations he was getting afterward, getting letters from pretty high profile people who certainly were not Catholics themselves. And there's also one other piece that I don't mention in the paper, but Keneally implies in some other works that the natural law is something that, because it's so foundational to the creation of the universe, in a certain sense, it comes before Christ. So obviously there's a certain theological complexity there with the Trinity and the Catholic understanding thereof, but because it was something that wasn't necessarily exclusive to the uppercase C Catholic tradition, he was able to really emphasize the lowercase c Catholic part of it. And in that way, he found something that was appealing to non-Catholics, but so familiar to the Catholic imaginary that made it effective. And then just one other point that I think is interesting on the foundationalism part, Keneally was a very, he was actually for anything that he was well known for, he was well known for his legal foundationalism. He was very involved in writing against the legal realists at mid-century, along with some other American Jesuits, including John Ford. But his foundationalism was only really requiring a belief in God's creation, and in doing so, the fundamental human equality of each person. So in that way, his foundationalism was a rather simple foundationalism, only predicated on kind of really what the Declaration says, endowed by the Creator. So in that way, he was able to articulate a theory of the natural law supported by reason, and then also by empirical sciences. And in another product, I explore kind of different ways that those who rejected Keneally's natural law still accepted Keneally's presentation of racial equality, because the natural law is so unique in its defensibility by reason and by empiricism. Thanks for the question.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to give Professor McKinnon an opportunity to face his accusers here, as his name has been invoked a number of times. But I also open it to any crosstalk that that you'd like to have take place among the presenters. If Mark wants to interject more, anyone else in the audience, you're welcome. Given the small nature of our group here, you're welcome to just unmute yourself and we'll just have a dialogue for another 10-ish minutes or so.
Well, I don't feel especially accused, but I will take that cue to pose a comment and a question for Adam. So on this theme of kind of the Protestant contexts for this, I do think probably almost all of the Protestant players in your story took for granted Reinhold Niebuhr's critique of the social gospel, which was partly an internal critique, so they would carry over some of it. But I think Niebuhr is the main reason why you wouldn't see any of these people saying liberation theology is the glorious next step in the upward rise of our social gospel tradition. What I'm curious about is what happened to Sergio Torres's Catholicism as a result of his hanging out not only with so many individual Protestants in the United States, but with him becoming somewhat kind of dependent on the institutional structures of the National Council of Churches and so forth. And when I read early Gutierrez, for example, the thought world feels almost entirely Catholic, both Latin American and European. But was Sergio Torres very different from that by the time he got done with his time in the United States? And what did he bring back to Chile or wherever it was that he went next?
That is a really good question, and one that I don't have a very good answer for. Yeah, in part because the sort of archival, the extant archival materials are just sort of about the Theology in the Americas project as such, and we don't get a great sense of, as the project sort of moves out of Torres's control, we don't get a great sense of what happens to Torres. I'm hoping that I'll be able to just ask him about that. Hopefully I'll be able to set up an interview. I think that will be the most helpful. But yeah, it's been challenging to find really any of his sort of significant writings after the mid 1970s. So yeah, I haven't been able to figure that out through the archival research yet. It's a great question though.
Thank you.
I have a further question for Liam. Liam, how, if we allow, let's say, that in some sense both Boston and Plymouth were theocracies, how would you delineate the difference between those two? What would you say?
Sure. So I think I'll confess in this answer that I'm much more familiar with the primary sources of Plymouth than I am of Boston. But having compared the two, at least to a small extent, I think part of the delineation is what I had mentioned briefly in your first question about the much stronger perception of individual Protestantism that the separatists had compared even to the Puritans. Even their names itself, Puritanism was inherently to purify the Church of England and rectify what they saw as the excesses of the Episcopalian nature of it. And separatism was at its core rejected anything that would have to do with the church hierarchy. So
I believe they called the Church of England a harlot, unless I'm mistaken. So
yes, and I can say certainly worse that they called the Pope and the Catholic Church. So their views in that sense were, if at anything, more puritanical than the Puritans, which I believe in an extent bled over to the way that they defined their legal system. So there's a source, I believe by a man named Hugh Peters, who discusses he was a lawyer and discussed his views of the Boston legal system and draws a lot of parallels between the way that they structured their different acts and ordinances and connects them to biblical text. And you don't see anything like this with the way that the fundamentals, which is what Plymouth called their book of laws, there's no similar source that's making those connections. So even though the influence might have been there, the spirit, the ethos of separatism infused in the legal system, there was much less of that direct textual representation, even compared with English laws, if you add a third prong to that comparison. When you look at sources like Edward Coke, excuse me,
it's pronounced Coke, actually. So it's spelled Cook, but it's pronounced Coke, isn't it?
Oh, I think it's the inverse, that it's spelled Coke and it's pronounced Cook. Either way, that guy, his sources even reference direct biblical texts. I mentioned one of them with Leviticus, and nothing like that is found, with the exception of Granger's case when we look at the records of Plymouth. So I think that is where you can draw a line in a tripartite comparison of England, Boston, Plymouth.
Dennis, can I ask just one quick question about Keneally? I reading through your paper, I noticed that a lot of what you are drawing upon are archival materials here at BC. I'm curious, has Keneally been studied much at all? I mean, has his name been invoked at all in other projects?
That's a great question. So he actually barely appears in the history of Boston College, which is the funny part. There's one article.
By design, maybe?
Perhaps. There's one brief article on his role in the GI Bill, published by a former student at the law school. And then he gets a mention in a footnote by two legal scholars, John Breen and Lee Strang, about his participation in the anti-legal realism campaign. But he's been almost completely erased. Or I guess you can't erase something that never appeared in the first place from the canon.
And let me ask this. Maybe this is I know you sort of touched on some of this, but what do you think? Why do you think that's the case? I mean, obviously, John Courtney Murray sort of reigns supreme when it comes to Catholic Jesuits and natural law and American ideals, but why Keneally's being hidden?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a complicated question. I think part of it has to do with the fact that during the civil rights movement, which is how he really gained most of his initial notoriety, and relative to that, that was kind of John Lafarge's house. There were a lot of Jesuits writing during that period, so it was almost like they weren't competing with each other in a sense, but there were a lot of Jesuits talking all at the same time.
Thus it always is too. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So I think part of it has to do with the fact that there was just a lot being produced from the Catholic intellectuals. And then part of it also has to do with the fact that, and John Breen and Lee Strang mentioned this briefly in their article, because of some historiographical trends and how non-Catholics look at Catholic involvement in American history, just the interest, broadly speaking, in Catholic involvement at the mid-century moment isn't huge. So he's coming at a really interesting time, right before JFK, right before Murray. Actually, part of the project, I think, is really dating a little bit before Murray, how this natural law idea caught on in the American context. But I think he just came a little bit too early for historians to care about him. So he's the subject of my master's thesis. Who knows, maybe I'll give him a little bit of justice, but we'll see with what success.
And also, just a footnote to that, I think both of them were, in a sense, silenced. And Keneally was sent away from Boston College. John Courtney Murray was silenced for 4 years. He was not allowed to publish. He continued to write, but he was not allowed to publish anything. And the thing that, in a sense, redeemed him and made him famous was his role as a peritus at the Second Vatican Council, because he actually wrote the first draft of Dignitatis Humanae, which became the Vatican Declaration on Human Freedom, on religious rights. So that gave Murray a spotlight that, unfortunately, Keneally didn't have a second act quite as glamorous as that, unfortunately. So.
Well, let me thank all of our presenters, Liam and Dennis and Adam, and thanks, Mark, for your response. I would like to remind you that our next session begins in about 15 minutes, 1:45. We have 2 concurrent sessions. And then also a reminder at 3:20 to please reconvene for our concluding remarks and the presentation of the award for best student paper. So I hope you'll join us later on and in our next session, and we'll see you around. Thanks so much.